The debate over the origin of COVID has become toxic and deeply divisive in the context of whether it was a result of a laboratory leak in Wuhan, China, or a consequence of exotic food in its wet market. Last week, both the US Department of Energy, or the DOE, which is in charge of labs in America, and Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI Director Christopher Wray sharpened the lab leak theory by saying the virus could have potentially leaked from a Wuhan lab. This is even as four US intelligence agencies disagreed with the assessment. Even though the DOE and Wray spoke with low and moderate confidence, respectively, the COVID origin has once again come under a sharp focus. To get a perspective on the debate, Mayank Chhaya Reports spoke to the well known Australian immunologist Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky, who was among the few scientists to have suggested at least to consider the lab leak possibility about 2 years ago. Then Dr. Petrovsky and few other scientists like him were, much to their dismay, derided as conspiracy theorists. With the pronouncements by the DOE and FBI director, the Wuhan lab leak possibility has been dramatically revived. Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky spoke to MCR from Colorado, where he is visiting. First of all, welcome back, Dr. Petrovsky. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The debate over the origin of COVID has become toxic and deeply divisive in the context of whether it was a result of a laboratory leak or not. Where do you stand on it since we last spoke?
So the controversy hasn't stopped, of course, and the controversy won't stop until we have a definitive answer. If we ever do get a definitive answer, this controversy may go on forever. That's possible.
Right.
But, as we stand today, I don't think we're any closer to the truth than when we last spoke. So the science and the data that's available hasn't changed. What's changed is people's perspective, and also understanding that the polarization of the scientific debate early, because of this spraying of the term, conspiracy theories, and by a number of scientists, turns out that in itself was a conspiracy. So they deliberately set out to change the agenda, and I think now people understand that. Initially, they thought these are very eminent scientists, they must be right, and so that really meant that the debate became sort of neutralized. There wasn't a debate, which there should have been. I think now we're getting closer to a willingness to have a debate, which we need to have because it's a scientific question that hasn't been answered. The only way to find answers is to explore possibilities, and that means having an open mind, which obviously they were trying to prevent, an open discussion right back at the very beginning.
One point that you had made then, and I think you perhaps still continue to make, is how supremely human adapted the virus was. Has there been more work done in that area, or that was that?
So I guess the science since has really just confirmed what we initially described right back at the very beginning, which was that this is an exceptionally well-adapted virus for humans from what we believe to be the very first isolates, and that is again unusual for a pandemic virus. Normally they have to build strength in a new species, which takes a little bit of time. Obviously, since then, we've seen the virus itself mutate even further, not so much to increase its ability to infect cells, but more and more to escape the pre-existing immune immune response, whether induced by prior infections or by vaccination. And again, that's a property we predicted. But so what we're seeing is the normal progression of the virus as it continues to mutate, adapt, and optimize. It still makes it very surprising how well adapted it was at the very beginning. The fact that it's adapted since doesn't detract from that.
As someone who is not part of the world that you dwell in, would you care to explain what the overarching purpose is of creating viruses of this nature? It's almost as if we are messing around a bit when we perhaps don't need to the extent that we do.
Look, I mean, science is about exploration, and why do we manipulate viruses and explore possibilities? Why do we go to the moon or want to go to Mars? I think it is part of the human condition that we don't accept the status quo. We really want to push boundaries and understand the limits of nature. And maybe in all of us, there's an element of we all want to be a creator. In a way, manipulating a virus, creating a virus gives you the power that in the old days was ascribed only to God. And so I think there's a large element of ego that often will drive this type of research. But as I say, I do think this is natural for humans to push boundaries. Sometimes we have to set boundaries because humans try to push them too far, and that may incur risks. And I think that's what you're alluding to. But I don't think we should say this is that doing viral research is a bad thing, or that adapting viruses and trying to understand them better is not a bad thing. But there may be some things where we have to be just more cautious, have more precautions built around it. But I'm certainly not a person who would say we should shut down a whole area of science because it's scary. That's like saying you shouldn't go to Mars because that's scary. Bad things may happen. I think we do have to allow humans to explore, the outer boundaries and do these things. But maybe we need to be more careful about how it's done.
No, indeed, I agree with you. My larger point was, going to Mars may not be the same as tempting fate in creating a virus of this nature. Say for the sake of argument.
I'm not sure about that. So what happens if there are viruses on Mars, which a lot of people believe that, there may well be. I know that Ted Steele, who's a professor, in New South Wales, believes that COVID-19 actually was seeded from asteroids into the atmosphere. And he's a very credible, it might sound crazy, but to be honest, he is a credible scientist, and he's published extensively on these ideas that, some viruses may actually come and be seeded from outer space. So if Mars is covered in viruses, the danger is that those astronauts may pick up those viruses and come back to Earth with some very nasty virus we've never seen before that could devastate humanity. So there are risks in everything, and we shouldn't be dismissive of that. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't do that activity. And so that was my point of going to Mars and doing these things. There are a lot of things out there. There's more things, in the universe than we're aware of.
Absolutely.
We'd be foolish to think that we can control all risks, because we can't. But we should still be careful.
Yeah. Or perhaps as a civilization or as a species, we should rationalize that life itself is essentially dangerous. And we have to accept the measure of that.
And maybe we're too arrogant. Maybe if a virus exterminated humanity, maybe the planet would be better off. I mean, we are very egotistical as a
Indeed.
species,
Indeed.
and we do believe that it's so important that humans continue to exist, and that
I
we have
agree.
to, and that we have to avoid risk of something cataclysmic. But the dinosaurs got wiped out, but the Earth
No
continued
fault of
to
theirs,
evolve.
I'm saying for
look,
no fault of theirs. I'm talking about dinosaurs being wiped out for no fault of theirs.
No, exactly. But either way, they were wiped out. But the point being that life on Earth continued, and obviously we arose out of that. If humanity was because of its own fault, maybe or not, was to cease to exist, there may be something better would arise in our place, just as we would believe we're a better sort of solution than the dinosaurs were. So yeah, it's a fascinating point as to what risks should humanity take or not take to protect itself, because we're assuming somehow we're better than everything else. And that it's nice to think that, but is it true from a planetary perspective? Maybe we're a dead end, and there's some other life form that if we were removed, would take our niche and do better. But that's not to say I want a cataclysmic event to wipe out humanity.
I agree.
I'm a humanist, and I would like to protect humans, but I'm just reflecting on the fact we are an egotistical race.
Yeah, we need to check our hubris for sure. I agree there. So, the U.S. Department of Energy, as well as FBI Director Christopher Wray, surprisingly, both have almost spoken in unison about the potential that it may have been a leak. And in a sense, do you see that as vindication of what you said such a long time ago?
Look, absolutely. Again, I think that the problem was that, these government bodies are very conservative. And when they all saw, a group of very preeminent scientists as a group say, the idea that this came from anything other than an animal is preposterous, and anyone, adopting that view as a conspiracy theorist, clearly those large government organizations, that pushed them a million miles away. They didn't want to be seen as crackpots, or these again are major institutions, and they have reputations that they want to protect. And so I think in that atmosphere where we had this conspiracy really to suggest that there was only one possibility, meant that these organizations sort of might have internally formed a view, but I think weren't prepared to make that view public, to really sort of protect the integrity of their institutions and their reputations. I think now that it's been exposed that really was a conspiracy, then suddenly I think these organizations feel more comfortable to express what they've probably been thinking perhaps all along, or at least for some time. It's now safe to express themselves, and as I say, I think that's a tremendous change, and hopefully a lot of these other organizations that have sat on the fence and equivocated about it, and I think WHO has been one of those, which appeared to be almost part of the conspiracy, and then the director sort of went the other way and openly said that he thought it was a serious possibility that this was a man-made virus in some way. Hopefully now we'll have a much more open debate, because it's an open question. None of us know. I mean, the only person who would know is either the animal it came from or the scientist who was involved in its creation. The rest of us can hypothesize
Right.
and look for circumstantial evidence, which we have and others have, which is quite strong, I would say, circumstantial evidence, but still it's not definitive. So we need a debate.
That's a perfect segue for me. You mentioned that perhaps the only person that might know definitively would be the scientists involved. Uh, there is next to no chance that China would allow any debate on this, let alone allowing any scientists involved in the project to say anything at all. With China being a complete dead end, what do we do as an international community? What are the options?
Look, I agree that in the current political environment, it's not got any better. I would argue, the relationship between US, China, Russia has deteriorated, unfortunately. It was bad enough at the start of the pandemic.
Right.
It's obviously worse now. So the idea that we're going to get cooperation is not going to happen, at least not in the next few years, I imagine. Maybe later. Scientists as a group are hard to control. So they're individual. They travel. They speak.
Right.
They get drunk. So I think that if it really did come down to this was in some way there was human intervention, like deliberate human intervention in making it or making something like it that turned into it, it may leak out indirectly in that way. There's also the possibility that it occurred, and I discussed this previously, it arose in a laboratory with no knowledge of the people who were managing the samples. And so it could be, and maybe that's the most plausible explanation, is that because these samples were being cultured and, you don't necessarily know what's in your sample. It could be highly infectious. You don't know if something splashes in your eye from a sample,
Right.
and so it's still possible that there's no scientist who even knows how it happened. Do you know what I mean? They may have suspicions, and I think the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology put in new containment systems, they put in a lot of new regulations, sterilization systems, air conditioning that we know after this event, to me suggests that they at least have a suspicion that it somehow arose from the lab. But it doesn't mean that they were actually deliberately creating this virus. It could still have just been inadvertent, coming out of a sample that they were culturing, infecting a lab member who then went out and infected other people unknowingly. That's still a plausible, again, possibility, which means that they don't even know exactly how it happened. You know what I mean? They would have a suspicion, but because they didn't create it, they wouldn't quite know exactly what happened. So again, this is not about pointing fingers or suggesting anyone has deliberately done anything. But it's still a strong possibility this virus came out of a laboratory experiment.
Right. I find it hilarious that the fate of the world or the world of virology depends on a few drunk Chinese scientists who might suddenly say something that they were not supposed to say. It's hilarious.
But that's how information often leaks and gets
Indeed.
out. I mean, all manner of information gets shared over a few drinks, and some of that can be confidential, secret. If I would love to have a few drinks with the Chinese scientists to really get their inner perspectives. How do they feel about this? Do they feel victimized? Do they acknowledge, that there's reason or that there's a strong argument? Doesn't mean it's right, but would they acknowledge the other side of the debate? Because a good scientist would. He'd say, look, you're entitled to put that hypothesis forward. I personally, I was there and I don't believe you're right, but you're entitled to explore that hypothesis. If they tried to say, how dare you, that often will alert you to the fact they're hiding something, and maybe they do know a lot more. And so the way people behave in response to these, raising these possibilities, often tells you a lot about what really did happen.
According to the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker, as of today, we are talking about 676 million total cases and 6.8 million deaths, which is about 1%. Now, 6.8 million deaths is a huge number. It's more than most major wars since the Second World War. And yet, we are still struggling to zero in on the cause. What do you think the international community, including China, can do to fundamentally alter this defensiveness that has come after the pandemic, especially within the Chinese establishment? They are defensive about it. And that's the reason why they wouldn't let it open to the rest of the community, international community.
So, in fact, just coming back to the initial figures you raised, we know that at least 6 billion people have been infected to date. So the 600 million figure is people who've had a diagnosed infection, with a PCR test. But if we do serological surveys that using antibodies to say, well, what percentage of the population has been infected so far, it's about 80% of the world's population. So in truth, the true denominator of infections is about 6 billion plus. In terms of deaths, yes. I mean, again, that 6 million that were identified. If you look at a lot of the analyses, they suggest that maybe there's 1 or 2 additional deaths for everyone that was officially reported, particularly in countries like India or even China. I mean, China, have done a very strange thing with their statistics, where they claim almost no one in China has died of COVID. I mean, we all know that's completely false. Why they do it, I don't know. But that means official statistics, incorporate the fact no one out of 1.2 billion Chinese has died of COVID. So that 6 million is clearly an underestimate. Whether it's double that, 12 million, or triple that, 18 million, it's even bigger than you're saying. Although the mortality rate, because the 6 billion people have been infected, is actually much lower than is suggested. It's more like 0.1%. But nevertheless, a big problem. Fortunately or unfortunately for them, the vast majority of people who've died have been over 80 years of age and people who have largely been on their deathbed anyway. So we also have to factor that in, that if someone dies from COVID, but they were going to die of old age a month later, that is less of an issue for us in public health than if a perfectly healthy 20-year-old were to die of COVID. So we have to, again, with the statistics, you have to dig into it to get a true picture of what has been the impact on the globe. And maybe, and I think people are now, starting to reassess and say maybe the impact wasn't as great as some of those figures might imply. So that's why I say it's, there may be more deaths, but in fact, we've overestimated the impact. 1, because there were a lot more infections than we realize, and 2, because a lot of the people dying were going to die anyway of other things. Nevertheless, we've had 3 years, a horrendous 3 years. I've had a horrendous 3 years. I
Right.
suspect you and everyone else has
Yeah.
had a horrendous 3 years. Total disruption to our lives, to travel, to families. And I think fear. I mean, I have patients who've lived in fear for three years
Right.
that they will get it and they will die from it. We can't underestimate that impact, even for the people who didn't die, who had mild infections. Didn't mean that they weren't terrified of dying. So yes, the impact has been enormous. The evidence is it came from China. I mean, they would like to suggest it came from somewhere else. And
Right.
I think it's done a lot of, playing with data and publishing papers that to suggest it was imported. But for all intents and purposes, it started in China. We know there was a massive cover-up by the authorities in China. Even the Chinese scientists have been, quite public that there was a cover-up,
Right.
which is why it became a pandemic. So even if it didn't come from China, the cover-up by China actually is responsible for a global pandemic. It could have been controlled if there'd been early intervention and basically containment, like we did with SARS. That was a
Right.
much more lethal virus. We completely eradicated it.
Right.
Without vaccines, without antivirals, just by simply identifying people who were contacts and isolating them until they were clearly either not infected or recovered from infection, from taking those, very simple basic principles early on, we were able to eradicate it. That should have been the case for COVID-19. It wasn't
Right.
because there was a massive Chinese government cover-up. We shouldn't forget that. So even if it didn't come from China originally, I believe it did. But even if you thought it didn't, they have a responsibility because it could have been shut down then and we wouldn't have had a global pandemic. They're the key questions, I think that need to be put to the Chinese, that they need to take responsibility for and tell us how that isn't going to happen next time. So what guarantees can they give that there won't be another attempt at a cover up the next outbreak that occurs in China? Unless we have that guarantee, we're all, vulnerable to another global pandemic.
Absolutely. And it's astonishing that what you're raising essentially comes down to one man, Xi Jinping, who has basically concentrated all powers in him as an individual. So to think that a single individual will decide whether what you're saying will happen, it is unsettling, it's extraordinary, and it's unbelievable at some level.
Look, yeah, I mean, in this case, I think the evidence points to the local officials in Wuhan who covered it up, even from the central authorities. So I don't know that you can put the responsibility on him for the initial cover up, but
No. I'm saying now.
Oh, but absolutely. But I think that what you can put to the head of the Chinese Communist Party is that they created the system in which the local officials felt that their duty was to cover it up.
Right.
And so that says there's something terribly wrong with the system that they've created, and that they need to fix that. So it's not saying that they knew about it and they told the officials to cover it up, but they have created a system where cover up is normal. It's like, as you say, they won't disclose the number of deaths from COVID. To this day, no one believes the Chinese data. It's almost in their system. Their system is designed to cover things up,
Right.
and that is not the way you deal with viral outbreaks. You need complete transparency. You need intelligence, and you need information in real time so that you can act.
Right.
So cover-ups might work for political sort of objectives. They don't work when you're dealing with viral outbreaks, and China needs to change its whole way in which it treats infectious disease outbreaks separately to how they treat everything else that happens in China, where cover-ups are obviously normal and not telling the truth or manipulating the numbers is completely normal and part of their system. For outbreaks, and they did this with SARS, they covered it up, so this isn't the first time they've done it. It's part of their system, and we're all vulnerable until they change that system. And I think that's where the pressure needs to be put on China, that it has to be transparent with infectious disease outbreaks. It's not acceptable that they have this habit of trying to cover things up.
Yeah, just last couple of things. One is I've been reading that the virus debate has been toxic even for interpersonal relationships within the scientific community. There are tensions, people have grown apart, friendships have been lost. What has been your personal experience there?
Look, it has been toxic. As I say, as part of these early attempts by a particular group of scientists, what they've attempted to do is take control of the various scientific societies and then use them to run this propaganda war against anyone asking questions about the origins. I had letters from the Australian Virology Society saying, anonymous members have complained about some of your comments in the media. It has been toxic and completely anti-scientific. They have manipulated the political system, the scientific establishment, the Royal Academies, the Academy of Science in the US, have all been enlisted in an attempt to really pervert the cause of science and silence this debate. And there's nothing that these people haven't attempted to do to anyone who's continued to try to raise these important issues.
Right.
So yes, it's been toxic. It's been damaging, both emotionally, to be shunned by fellow scientists, to be attacked by official institutions, to question your credibility as a scientist, to make it difficult for you to publish any of your research findings, shutting you off from grants.
Right.
As I say, it's insane the level to which this group has gone, in this conspiracy to shut down any questioning of, where did the origin of this virus come from? And then because of the, given the extraordinary lengths they've gone to, what's their motive?
Right.
It has to be, to go to the lengths they've gone, there has to be, you would think, a massive agenda or motive that's driving them to do this. And I think, again, that's a question that should be put to them. Now you've been exposed, tell us what your motive was in trying to pervert the science agenda in this way.
To that end, I read in the Australian today that you're about to lose your academic affiliation with Flinders. What's the real picture there? I mean, you've been described as a refusenik, for instance. What's going on there?
Look, yeah, I mean, this is just part of the ongoing campaign that these people have been mounting against anyone who's questioned, the narrative and that they've been trying to disseminate. So they'll attack you on any front, and as I say, try to challenge your credibility, lobby your university to remove your academic status, which is obviously what that article is alluding to. So the attacks come from every direction, and it's clear what's motivating it, which is for them to control the narrative, and silence anyone who questions, anything about, their narrative on COVID, whether it's the origins, whether it's the way the mRNA vaccines were developed. In other words, it's a group who want only one side of any of these scientific questions to be seen. And it's as I say, it's not been pleasant when all
Right.
you're trying to do is be a good scientist, and a good scientist is open-minded. They look at all possibilities and then try to systematically exclude the ones that are incorrect, and hopefully end up with the correct possibility. But these people they shouldn't be allowed to call themselves scientists, because what they're trying to do is say there's only one perspective and there's only one right answer, and that's the answer we give you, and we don't want to even prove to you how did we come up with that answer. You just have to accept it. That is anti-science, and as I say, those of us who are fighting to get science back in the center, and again, as I say, this is not just about the origins. It's about, what's the scientific evidence for locking down whole populations rather than just the people who've been in contact with, say, a virus early on. What's the evidence for shutting down whole countries? What's the evidence for cloth masks or flimsy surgical masks for preventing viral transmission? What's the true status of the mRNA vaccines? Were they, properly developed, or was it short-circuited? These are all questions that we should be debating as scientists, and they're questions that this group do not want to see any debate. So the way they attack you is obviously to try and cut you off and isolate you, including by lobbying your institutions, whether that's the universities, or through the academic societies, or through the medical boards. This is the way they've been operating for 3 years. I mean, it's insanity, but I can tell you it's very real. And I'm not the only person they've tried to silence. They've been trying to silence doctors and scientists all around the world in this way. It's extraordinary, the level of coordination that is required to take out, eminent scientists and doctors globally and silence them all at the same time. Imagine the level of coordination and the power you would have to be able to do that. And yet that's what they've done.
It sounds depressing.
It is depressing if we don't get it back to where it was before.
Right.
In other words, I would just like the world to get back to where it was 4 years ago, when the scientific establishments worked, where there wasn't this attempt to take control at a level we've never seen before, and really, whether it was because they felt that with a pandemic, it's better to only have one voice, to have one opinion, but what if that opinion is wrong? And I think in many cases it has been wrong, and that's a fundamental problem in our society now, that if you have a group who say, okay, it's a pandemic, so we make the orders and everyone obeys, and it doesn't matter whether we're right, we're wrong, whether the science is in favor of what we're saying or not in favor, you just have to all do it, and anyone who questions it is going to be ostracized and exiled. I mean, that sounds more like Soviet Russia, or I mean,
it does.
It's not the world in which we thought we were living. until we experience the last 3 years.
Yes. What's your personal plan? Do you go back soon, or do you consider maybe something here in the US?
Yeah, look, that's exactly what I'm doing at the moment, is exploring,
Okay.
where is a safe home, a home where science is still, open-minded and allows you to probe important questions, and doesn't try and prejudge it, and only allow you, to do the bits of science that you're allowed to do because the rest is too scary or too controversial. I mean, the thing about science is you want to address the big controversial questions and find the answers. If you're not allowed to do that, it's futile being a scientist. So yeah, I want to find myself in an environment that embraces, that environment that used to be the case, where you're allowed to dig in and ask important, difficult questions. Sometimes, getting controversial answers, but that to me is science. So yes, we're exploring a home here in the US and elsewhere. If we can find such an environment that still has that ethos of science is about being open-minded, and sometimes you won't like the answers you might get, but still they're the answers.